Hey there everyone, welcome back to Bio 233 Anatomy and Physiology. We're working on reproductive system. We did male anatomy and physiology reproductive, and now we're going to do female. I'll probably split it up into 2 lectures. So why don't we go ahead and get started with the lecture notes here. So you can see that this is a cross-section of the female reproductive system, very similar to the model that we showed you guys in lab, and so one thing is I'm not going to fill this out right now, and if you go over to the book, you can see on page 1061 this figure, and it has everything filled in, and you can certainly take a look at that, and that'll help you both for your lecture and your lab. However, we might note a couple things here and talk about a few things on a couple of the other pictures that are on the following pages. So we'll definitely take a look for that. Now, reproductive system for the female is a lot more complex because it does multiple things, where the male reproductive system is basically to produce sperm and release those sperm. The female reproductive tract not only produces gametes, so ova, but it also transports, protects, and nourishes it. Okay, so, and it provides a suitable environment for the development of an embryo inside the uterus, and it also delivers the baby. So many different things. Much more complicated. Now, let's start here with the ovaries, and the ovaries are right here behind. This is the uterine tube and the kind of the wider opening of it, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But underneath there is where the ovary is. Actually, you can kind of see it right there. These are the female gonads. They're paired, of course, one on either side of the uterus. On the next page, you'll see a frontal section, and you can see them. They're about the size and shape of an almond. Blood supply goes by both ovarian and uterine arteries, and the ovaries kind of structure is got a couple different things. So there's germinal epithelium, which is just this cuboidal epithelium that covers the free surface of the ovary. And it's continuous with the perineum. So this is the visceral layer of the ovary. And then the tunica albuginea, which is this fibrous connective tissue that's deep to it. All right, and that, because it's fibrous connective tissue, is kind of keeping things out of the ovary itself, so infections don't come in, things like that, from the peritoneal cavity. And then we have the stroma, and this is deep connective tissue, and there's a cortex, and that's where the ovarian follicles are, which will mature to ova. And then there's a more inner loose layer of connective tissue, and that's the medulla layer. Okay. And there you can kind of see this here on the next page. So we've got the outermost layer right here. That's that kind of brown layer, and that is the germinal epithelium. By the way, this picture is... They have, I don't know if in your book they actually have this picture anymore, but they have a similar one on page 1061 also. That's an actual picture of an actual human ovary. So these are both pages 1061. But so we have the... things that we just put in here. We have the germinal epithelium, which is right there below that line. And then underneath it, we have the tunica right there. slightly. There we go. And then we've got a cortex, and here we have the medulla. And I'm not going to label those. I think you understand the cortex and medulla stuff now. But let's continue and look at the follicles themselves. So in an adult woman, one follicle usually matures fully and ruptures each month, releasing an oocyte. And these, the ova and oocytes kind of change over time. And so they have different developmental stages, and those are listed here below. So we start out at primordial follicle. And primordial follicles, these right here can be primordial follicles. We actually have them. There's a couple. I'm just going to put fol for follicle. These little tiny guys. Now they're one layer of squamous-like follicular cells and the oocyte inside. And then the primary follicle generally tends to be a couple layers. And so let's see if I move over here a little. Primary follicle. Okay, are those. And so they usually have two or more layers of more cuboidal cells, which are called granulosa cells, or follicular cells, granulosa cells. And then the secondary follicle starts to get larger, and we get a little bit of antrum or fluid-filled space in them. Okay, so and by the way, these are early primordial follicles. This is probably a late primordial follicle, just about to become a secondary follicle. So we have a secondary follicle there, okay, and that antrum is starting to form. You can see that antrum there starting to form, that fluid-filled space, and that's kind of the key. And then what happens is the oocyte will tend to move to one side, and we'll get a really big antrum. So see right here, this is a really large antrum. Here's the oocyte, and it's on a little stalk, okay? And this is called a Graafian or vesicular follicle. Okay. Oops, I spelled it wrong. There we go, vesicular follicle. And this is the most mature stage, as it says here. The oocyte sits on a stalk surrounded by fluid and is ready for ovulation. Now, this right here is showing ovulation where there's a rupturing. The fluid leaves. As the fluid leaves, the oocyte gets sucked out into the space surrounding the ovary. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And then what's left is a corpus luteum or corpus luteum. I've heard it pronounced both ways. And that is right here. So we'll type it in. And no more oocyte, it's left. It's after ovulation. It's kind of filled with fat. And what'll happen is it will start to produce progesterone and estrogen, mainly progesterone, for a limited amount of time. And if pregnancy doesn't occur, it degenerates and becomes the corpus albicans. So if pregnancy doesn't occur, it will degenerate or kind of go away, and it will become, let's use proper English here, it will degenerate and become the corpus albicans. And that's what this is right here. See how it's getting smaller, and eventually will kind of go away completely. And we'll move that over so it's not competing there. Okay, and so that's kind of what happens during one ovarian cycle. We have multiple primary follicles get stimulated. They start to become primary, secondary, and a few will start to get to this stage, and then one will rupture, and then usually when one ruptures, no more will rupture, and that will stop things. We'll talk more about how that all works later when we get into the physiology. Now you can see here here's a better view now where you can see the ovary on either side. There's the one that looks like the one above. They've made a cross section of it, and it's held by a couple ligaments. So we have the ovarian ligament, which is right there, and we have the broad ligament, which is the multiple things that are these very thin membranes, which are right here. And we also have the suspensory ligament, which is more posterior. And so those three ligaments just kind of hold it in place because it's kind of in the center of the peritoneal cavity, right, in the pelvic cavity. The suspensory ligament is where the ovarian arteries and nerves are coming from the ANS to kind of regulate things. And that's all we need to say about those ligaments. Now, if we look a little bit more here at some of the other structures, we're going to notice that there are two tubes, one each, that connects the ovary to the uterus, and those are called uterine tubes. They also sometimes are called fallopian tubes or oviducts. And we can, the whole thing right here, this is a uterine tube, and there are different parts of it. And so let's go ahead and fill those in all right here, these four different things. We'll talk about them. So they're about 4 inches long, and they're right next to the ovary, but they're not connected to the ovary. They're kind of laying on the ovary. You can almost see it almost looks like a little hand there that's kind of laying on the ovary, these little the little fimbriae, which are these little projections, which are kind of in place there. And there's different parts of the uterine tube. So the first is the isthmus, which is this very short, narrow part of the uterine tube that's right next to the uterus, right? And so we have that one. Actually, we can keep all these in the same color here because we'll just put them all in. So this is the site of attachment to the uterus. And I'll write that in just a minute. And then you can see up here, we get to the widest portion, which is called the ampulla. And this kind of curves around the ovary. And this is where fertilization usually occurs, is somewhere up in this upper part of the uterine tube. We'll talk more about that when we get to physiology. Okay, so if we kind of start putting these in order, we have ampulla, and then we have the isthmus right there. And then we have what's called the infundibulum. And this is the funnel-shaped opening at the distal end. And it has the fimbriae, which are finger-like projections. And these fimbriae, as I said a minute ago, are not connected to the ovary. It's open to the peritoneum. And so when an egg is released from the ovary, for a brief moment, it's actually in the peritoneal cavity, or in the pelvic cavity, the fluid, and then it gets swept by those little fimbriae, those little fingers, and kind of gets directed into the infundibulum and then to the ampulla, and then if fertilization is occurred, sperm usually will meet it somewhere up in this area here. So that's interesting, and there is a chance sometimes that the eggs will actually go into, not make it in, and just go into the peritoneal cavity. And if it's an unfertilized egg, that's not really that big of a deal. It will just get absorbed by the serous fluid that's there, the pericardial fluid, or the peritoneal fluid, and it'll be done. If a fertilized egg were to go out into the area and then embed into one of the walls, you could have an ectopic pregnancy where instead of embedding into the uterus, it embeds into the tube, which would be a tubal pregnancy, or down, and it leaves here and goes into the pelvic cavity, which is rare but can happen sometimes. All right, so so what in the uterine tube, there's a mucosa layer, and the mucosa contains both ciliated and non-ciliated columnar epithelium, and it's got a thick middle layer with smooth muscle, and we get peristalsis and ciliary action, the cilia beating, to move the ova toward the uterus. And if you remember when we were talking about the male physiology, if sperm gets into the uterine tube, it can actually reverse the peristaltic contractions and then have the ova kind of stay where it is and have the sperm be propelled towards it, which is, again, why it's more than likely that somewhere up here is where we have fertilization, because as the egg starts to go this way, the egg starts to go this direction, the sperm go this direction and start to cause contractions going that way, and so they kind of meet in the middle. All right, now we have the uterus itself, which you can see right here. It's kind of a pear-shaped, upside-down pear-shaped organ. It's got a body, which is this part. I'm not going to type it in right there, but this is the body. This top part is called the fundus. And then we have another isthmus right here, which is this narrowed part of the uterus. So those are the three main parts. And then we have the cervical opening. And I guess we can put in the cervix over here just because we have a room. Cervix there. And there we go. And then the cervical canal is the opening itself. And we can type that in as well. Okay, so I'm probably not going to add any more to that particular one. So if you want to look at that and write down anything you want, and then we're going to move on. This is the vaginal opening here. You could type that in if you want, the vaginal canal. All right, but now we'll move on to this. So the uterus is the site of menstruation, site of implantation of the fertilized ovum, and then obviously development of the fetus during pregnancy, and then it also is used for labor and delivery. So, I mean, that's kind of crazy, all the different amazing things that it does. 1, 2, 3, and 4 different things. It's located between the rectum and the bladder, and you can go back and look at that first page and see kind of its position. Well, actually, why don't we do that? So there you can see it's kind of tilted forward normally. That's the normal position of the uterus. Sometimes people have anteverted uterus, which it's tilted backwards towards the rectum, but this is normal. Here's the bladder, here's the rectum, here's the ovary slightly above it, there's the vaginal canal. So you can see all those things. And as I said earlier, and we'll just underline these, the dome-shaped region above the entrance is the fundus, the body is the main central portion, and the isthmus is the narrowing between the cervix and the body. And the cervix itself has the cervical canal, and the openings are called the internal and external os, which are the two openings. And anteverted is when, as I just said, when the I said it incorrectly. Anteverted is correct. So anteverted is when the fundus and body are flexed anteriorly in relation to the cervix. That's what we'll consider normal. All right. And then retroverted is opposite, and this is where it's tipped backward towards the rectum, and this is less common. So that's what I meant to say earlier. I apologize. The retroverted is the abnormal, the anteverted is the normal. and again, retrovert, I shouldn't say abnormal, because a certain percentage of the population have retroverted uteri, so it's just another way that the uterus can be positioned in the pelvis. It is less common. It is at a little higher risk of having problems with pregnancy and delivery. So there is that to note. The uterine wall. The uterine wall has 3 different layers. Let's show all those layers first, and then we will go and look at this picture a little bit more. So we have the perimetrium, which is the outermost layer. And I know normally we would call that endometrium, or epimetrium or something, but we don't. Perimetrium. And this is the visceral peritoneum, the outermost layer. Okay? Then we have, and it's not seen on this picture that you're looking at right there. Then we have the myometrium. And the myometrium is the middle layer, and I put it in red because it forms the bulk of the uterus, and it's got lots of smooth muscle. Okay? And this is going to allow for contraction, which helps deliver the baby. Okay? And then we have endometrium, which is the mucous membrane, and there's 2 layers. There's a basal layer and a functional layer. Okay? So the stratum functionalis is the one that undergoes developmental changes during the menstrual cycle. It thickens each month, becomes engorged with blood, and it's preparing for implantation. Right? Each month, the uterus is assuming that implantation could occur, that we could have a fertilized egg happen and implantation could occur. So each month, it prepares for that event. If it does not happen, then that layer, that functional layer, will be sloughed off during menstruation. There's the basal layer as well. This is the permanent layer, and this is responsible for ongoing production of the new functionalis after menstruation. So after menstruation, we want to build a new layer. Okay. Now there are some ligaments that hold the uterus together to it as well, in place. And I'm just going to unname them, but I'm not super worried about them right now. We've got the lateral ligament, the uterosacral ligament, and the round ligament, and that holds at different angles. So you can see the uterosacral holds it to the sacrum. The lateral ligament is running between the cervix and the vagina and the pelvic wall laterally, and the round ligament is near the broad ligament. And so all of those kind of hold it in place. Okay. Other than that, I'm not going to say much more about those. Okay. By the way, this picture here is showing you how the functionalis layer can thicken over time. And we have this picture is page 1065, something very similar to it. Page 1065. And we're going to go into a lot more detail about all the glands and capillaries and the muscles and stuff when we get into the physiology. So we're going to you can see it right now. We're looking at what looks like a secretory state of the uterus here with a bunch of uterine glands secreting glycogen and whatnot. We'll talk about all that stuff later. So we'll come back to that in our next lecture. All right, and then we have the vagina, which you can see here, the entrance to the vagina and then ending at the cervix. And so let's highlight a couple things about that. And by the way, this picture is a modified version of, we don't actually have that exact one in there. It's just a modified version of that 1061, kind of a close-up of it. And page 1061 has this there, so you can just kind of take a look at it in more detail. But, so it's a canal from the cervix to the exterior of the body, between the bladder and the rectum. 3 layers. So these layers, the innermost layer, the mucosal layer is stratified squamous epithelium. And again, that makes sense because this is an area where abrasion can occur. during intercourse, and so we want to have epithelium that can slough off and repair itself. And there are folds or rugae that will allow expansion of the vaginal canal. The middle layer is the muscularis layer, and again, it's made of smooth muscle, unsurprisingly, and can contract. And the outermost layer is adventitia, and remember, adventitia means it connects to other tissues to hold it in place, so there's connective tissue holding the vaginal canal kind of in its location. The fornix is the recess that surrounds the cervix as enters the vagina, and you can kind of see that right here. See the recesses here on either side. They've shown it in both of these. That's the fornix. I'm not going to draw it in, but you can see that there. The introitus is the vaginal orifice, although we often just refer to it as vaginal opening or vaginal orifice. There is often, not always, but often a hymen, which is a mucosa that's a vascular fold that may kind of round the border and the opening of that orifice. The vagina does not contain any mucus glands on its own. It receives secretions from the cervix. So the cervical opening will release secretions, and we'll get those. And one thing that it will get is it gets a large amount of glycogen. So large amounts of glycogen, which are metabolized into lactic acid. And that creates a low pH environment, around about 3 to 4. And this helps keep microbial growth under control. And this is one reason why the semen is more alkaline, so it can help neutralize this acid and make a more neutral environment for the sperm to be in. So externally, and this picture, by the way, is on page 1066. We have first the mons pubis, and the mons pubis is a deposition of fatty tissue over the symphysis pubis, which remember is the pubic bone. All right, which is right there. Obviously, it's covered with hair after puberty because that's one of the secondary sex characteristics that estrogen and progesterone produce. And then we have the labia majora and the labia minora. And one thing that we like to have you think about when we're doing this is during fetal development, at one stage during fetal development, the fetus is neither male nor female. It hasn't gone, it has its XY or XX chromosomes, but it hasn't gone down a developmental path to either be male or female. It kind of starts out in kind of a more neutral state, and then it goes one way or the other. And what they've seen is they've followed the tissues during development, and so they kind of look to see what tissues develop into what. And so, for example, the labia majora, all right, which is the outer, and I can type it in here. We can type these in right here. This is the majora, and this is the minora, labia, both. All right, so the majora is the outer folds, is homologous to the scrotum in the male. And so that's good to know. It has a outer surface is pigmented and covered with hair. The inner surface is smooth and hairless, and it is moist due to the large amount of sebaceous glands that are there. The minora is the inner part, and this is homologous with the ventral penis. And this also, smaller fold, has a lot of mucosa, and it surrounds the clitoris, which you can see right here. Just a little part of it, but whereas the clitoris is obviously much larger, it has kind of wings on either side that are inside, and it's much larger than that. We'll talk about that more in a second on the next page, I believe. And the menorah is very vascular and hairless as well. The vestibule is basically the area from right below the clitoris to the bottom of the vaginal opening. So we call this the vestibule. And this is where the urethra opening. So we have the urethra, I can spell correctly here, sorry. Urethral opening. That's still wrong. There we go. And vaginal opening, orifice, canal, whatever you want to say, are right there. Oh, I lied. This one is actually farther down. One more. Sorry. There. And so the vestibule is housing those two openings. Having some troubles again. There we go. And there are a number of glands that open into the vestibule. And so they're the greater vestibular glands, or Bartholin's glands. And these are homologous to the bulbourethral glands that we see in the male. And there are also Skene's glands, or paraurethral glands, or lesser vestibular glands, lots of names for it. And these are homologous to the prostate. And so these are mostly producing lubricating substances in the female. Now the clitoris, as I said, is it's homologous to the penis, and it is an elongated mass of erectile tissue with many nerve endings. The prepuce or foreskin covers it. Most of the body is covered by that. The exposed portion is called the glans. And it responds very similarly to the penis during sexual arousal. However, or I guess that however, the penis has a dual function, which is it allows the passage of urine and semen, and the clitoris does neither of those. So the clitoris is mainly just an organ of sexual arousal. The perineum is a diamond-shaped region which includes everything in the genital area there. So from the right above the clitoris all the way around the anus and back. That's called the perineum. And we'll just highlight that there. Diamond-shaped region. That's all we need to know about that. Now, we do want to talk briefly about mammary glands and remind ourselves a little bit about the hormones of mammary glands, which will be a good way to get us back into endocrine system in preparation for our final. And right here is a picture of them, and this is on page 1068. 1068. All right, so we have obviously the center of the mammary gland, the nipple, protrudes and has an areola pigment around it. And we can put those in right here if we want. The areola and the nipple. And notice it's on both sides. The arrows here and the arrows here go to the same things. Note behind is the pectoralis major muscle. Right there, you can see on both sides. And so as it says here, this is located the mammary glands are located superficial to the pectoral muscle. But internally, there's some adipose tissue. We can see a lot of adipose tissue there at the bottom of the screen. And then there are lobes, and those lobes are divided into lobules. So we have lobes, and those lobes are divided into lobules. We'll highlight those in just a second. And those lobules are composed of connective tissue, and there are milk-secreting cells called alveoli, which is always a little confusing because we have alveoli of your lung, and you have alveoli of the mammary tissue here. These alveolar glands convey milk to lactiferous ducts, which expand into small ampulla, and that's where there's a little milk reservoir, and then they open into the nipple itself. And there's suspensory ligaments that kind of hold and between the lobules and kind of keep everything kind of organized. So let's put in some of those things here on the page. So here's the suspensory ligaments right below. And you can see they're kind of separating one of the lobes. And here's another lobe and another lobe, another lobe. And then within those are lobules. All right, so we can go to one of these lobules here, one of the lobules, and put that in here. So let's see, and then those lobules become their little ducts. You can see where my highlighting, there's a little duct right there, and then it goes into an ampulla, and then that ampulla goes out through the opening of the ducts. So let's put all those in. So we have the opening of the ducts right there, and we have a little ampulla, and then we have the duct itself. And then we have the lobule with a bunch of alveoli in them. Okay, that is probably all we need to talk about from a structural point. Now let's remind ourselves about lactation and about some of the physiological processes here. So lactation is secretion of ejection of milk by the mammary glands. That's the definition. And at puberty, estrogen will promote growth and branching of the duct system in the breasts. Fat deposition will occur, and that'll increase breast and breast size. Progesterone will also contribute to breast growth as it increases. So both estrogen and progesterone will do that. And both estrogen and progesterone will cause the hypothalamus to secrete prolactin inhibiting hormone. And this happens during pregnancy. So there's no milk, and let's not say secretion, let's use the right word here. No milk production. That's actually incorrect because we remember that, prolactin produces, right? And that's what this says below here. We have prolactin, the major hormone responsible for milk production. So what happens, this is just a review, remember, we have stimulation. So let's say stimulation of the nipple by the infant. Messages go to the hypothalamus, which causes releasing hormone to be produced, prolactin releasing hormone. That travels through the portal system to the anterior pituitary. It releases prolactin, PRL is prolactin. That will go to the breast alveolar cells, and that will cause milk production. So that is mostly review. Now, maintaining milk production will depend on mechanical stimulation of the nipple by the infant suckling. All right, so that will continue to have production occur. That is that part. Now remember, milk letdown, the actual release, so that's the production, and then the release is also due to reflexive suckling, and that is oxytocin, and that is going to be released by the posterior pituitary. And this also, we might as well just write review because this is another thing that you've already learned. And that oxytocin causes myoepithelial cells of the breast, which we didn't list up there, but these are epithelial cells that have muscle-like contracting power. So even though they're not muscle, they contract like muscle, and they eject milk into the ducts, and into the ampulla, and then into the nipple and out. Okay, so that is a good overview of both the ovary and uterus and the external genitalia, and then a little bit about mammary glands. We also did physiology of mammary glands. Now we're going to go back and do physiology of the uterus and ovaries and the entire uterine and ovarian cycle and how gametes are produced. And that's what we'll be finishing on in our next lecture. Okay. All right. See you then.